Here, we explore the grim realities faced by a medieval soldier who chose to abandon the battlefield. Our journey covers 8 distinct stages, beginning with the immediate psychological collapse under pressure and extending to the profound, lifelong repercussions. What historical research uncovers is a truth far more harrowing, yet undeniably human, than popular imagination often portrays. Fleeing a medieval battle was hardly a simple act of self-preservation. In 1419, King Henry V's official ordinances of war explicitly condemned such an act as high treason, stipulating that any soldier found to have deserted his captain or the main host without explicit permission would be branded a traitor and put to death. Before delving into the intricate moral dilemmas, let's examine the stark realities presented by historical data. Counterintuitively, the decision to run often proved more lethal than standing firm and fighting. For instance, a staggering 28,000 men perished at the Battle of Toten in 1461, and this figure is no exaggeration. The vast majority of these fatalities did not occur during the fierce hand-to-hand combat itself, but rather during what military historians term the rout, the chaotic phase when one side's formations utterly disintegrated and its soldiers fled in panic. Pursuing cavalry ruthlessly cut down these fleeing soldiers in an area that subsequently became known as the Bloody Meadow, and the nearby Cockbeck River was said to have literally run red with blood. Before we venture deeper into these dark historical shadows, take a moment to consider this. What compels you to continue listening, even as the details become increasingly difficult to confront? Is it the raw truth, the immersive atmosphere, or perhaps the quiet companionship of these shared narratives? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've just joined us, remember to subscribe and stay a while. Now let us begin. Chapter 1: The Weight of the Shield. Medieval battles were rarely sudden, explosive bursts of violence. Instead, hours, sometimes even days, would drag on as men waited, poised for engagement. During this agonizing period of anticipation, a unique and intense psychological pressure steadily mounted, a crucial factor we must comprehend to truly understand why disciplined formations eventually shattered. Common soldiers within medieval armies operated under a fundamentally different motivational framework than their knightly counterparts. Knights, from their earliest childhood, were steeped in what historians describe as the cult of honor, a comprehensive system encompassing heraldry, epic songs, and a rigid social structure, all reinforcing the belief that a glorious death in battle represented the pinnacle of human achievement. In stark contrast, the individual holding a spear within a shield wall was likely a conscripted peasant, possibly enticed by the vague promise of pay which he probably hadn't even received yet. He certainly harbored no romantic illusions about the nature of combat. Even before the opposing lines officially clashed, his body would already be reacting intensely to an overwhelming sensory assault. Historical research vividly recounts this experience: thousands of unwashed men packed tightly together in dense formations. The stench alone would have been suffocating, while the incessant clang of metal, armor clinking, weapons being sharpened, combined with the collective clamor of thousands of voices in a confined space, created an oppressive soundscape. Banners and pennants, fluttering chaotically, contributed to a sense of visual disorientation. This pervasive confusion meant that understanding what was unfolding merely 50 feet away, let alone across the entire expanse of the battlefield, was an impossibility. Medieval soldiers lacked the modern understanding of the profound physiological responses occurring within their own bodies. Your heart begins to pound, your hands start to tremble uncontrollably, and you feel as though you cannot catch your breath. This is your sympathetic nervous system activating, adrenaline surging through your entire system. Today, we possess the language to describe these reactions; they did not. Compounding their terror was the profound distress of not comprehending why their own bodies seemed to be betraying them so utterly. Contemporary research into medieval PTSD reveals accounts of soldiers becoming utterly paralyzed by fear even before the battle commenced. Some men would begin to tremble uncontrollably, unable to cease, while others found themselves inexplicably unable to firmly grasp their weapons. Chroniclers of the era meticulously documented these behaviors, though naturally, they lacked our modern terminology to categorize them. This, then, represents the insidious psychological trap. As a common soldier, You are acutely aware that running away is legally classified as treason, carrying an undeniable death penalty. Yet you also know, with grim certainty, that to remain means voluntarily stepping into a brutal meat grinder. You stand there, grappling with this impossible calculation, while your primitive body screams at you to flee. Simultaneously, your rational brain attempts to override that primal instinct, reminding you that the penalty for desertion is death anyway. The internal conflict raging within a soldier during those agonizing moments before combat is a desperate struggle between two terrifying forms of death: immediate annihilation by enemy action, or a delayed, yet equally certain, demise at the hands of your own commander's justice. You are forced to make this agonizing choice while simultaneously enduring what we would now unequivocally recognize as a full-blown panic response. One final crucial point regarding this pre-battle psychological state: there was absolutely no concept of mental health support, nor any understanding of combat stress. Displaying fear was not perceived as a natural human reaction to mortal peril. It was unequivocally seen as an act of cowardice, a profound moral failing. The complete absence of any framework to contextualize their overwhelming terror often burdened soldiers with an additional layer of shame, even before the fighting had even properly begun. They believed there was something uniquely wrong with them, when, in reality, they were simply experiencing the same fundamental physiological response that humans have exhibited to life-threatening danger throughout our entire evolutionary history. What truly resonates with me here is this: we dedicate so much discourse to glorifying medieval combat, yet the overwhelming majority of men on those battlefields were utterly terrified and desperately wished not to be there. They were not valiant characters plucked from a heroic epic. They were farmers or humble laborers, unwillingly conscripted and thrust into someone else's war. And the fact that their entirely natural fear was construed as a moral failing, rather than a predictable human reaction, imposed a layer of profound cruelty on top of the already immense physical dangers they confronted daily. Chapter 2: The Breaking Point. Now, we arrive at the critical moment itself, when a single soldier, a small group, or even an entire military unit makes the fateful decision to abandon formation and flee. Historical records consistently demonstrate that this was not a gradual erosion of morale, but rather an abrupt, catastrophic snap. It was a sudden, cascading failure, spreading through the ranks with the speed and force of a deadly contagion. Specific, powerful triggers often precipitated this collapse. Witnessing a unit's banner fall was the most prevalent catalyst. In medieval warfare, banners were far more than mere decorative symbols. They served as indispensable navigational beacons and potent psychological anchors. Your banner indicated your unit's precise location, your intended direction, and crucially, confirmed that your command structure remained intact. A fallen banner unequivocally signaled one of two dire outcomes: either your commander had been struck down, or your unit was in grave, potentially insurmountable, peril. Another potent trigger was observing your own commander flee. This occurred with surprising frequency. Nobles and knights, mounted on horseback, possessed superior mobility, allowing them to extricate themselves from danger far more readily than their foot soldier counterparts when the tide of battle turned against them. The instant the men in the shield wall saw the very individual entrusted with leading them abruptly turn his horse and ride away, their desperate calculus of survival shifted instantaneously. This is precisely where the devastating contagion of fear came into play. Medieval military formations, by their very nature, demanded collective cohesion to function effectively. The formidable shield wall, for instance, operated only because every man steadfastly held his position. Yet, the moment even one individual drops their shield and turns to run, they instantly create a critical gap. That gap becomes a glaring vulnerability that the enemy will immediately, mercilessly exploit. The soldier positioned next to this newly formed void sees the magnified danger he now faces and, in turn, also breaks. Suddenly, you witness a cascading failure, a wave of disintegration sweeping through the entire line. Historical research often employs the chilling phrase, "the line snaps." One moment, you have a functional, disciplined military formation. The very next, you are confronted with a chaotic mob of men, each making individual, panic-driven decisions to flee, and the collective structure has utterly dissolved. What proves particularly striking is that this breaking point frequently occurred before significant casualties had actually been inflicted. It wasn't that half the unit had been killed and the survivors then gave up. Rather, the immense psychological pressure simply reached an unbearable threshold, a specific trigger fired, and the decision to flee propagated through the ranks far more rapidly than the actual violence itself. The true mass killing, the staggering casualties, invariably followed after the line had broken, during the relentless pursuit. This brings us to the profound paradox of the rout. Statistically, staying in formation was demonstrably safer than running because the shield wall provided crucial mutual protection, and your odds were demonstrably better if you held your ground. However, fear does not operate on cold statistics. Fear is driven by an immediate, visceral perception of threat. And in that terrifying moment when the line snaps, every soldier is making a split-second decision based entirely on raw panic, not on calculated probability. The moment of breaking is also when individual agency forcefully reasserts itself in a way that had been completely suppressed before. Within the rigid formation, you were merely a component of a collective entity, moving when the unit moved, fighting where the unit fought. The instant you turn and run, you are making a stark, unilateral decision about your own survival, quite literally seizing your fate back into your own hands. There is something almost primal about that desperate act, even though, tragically, it typically worsened their chances. Here's what truly resonates with me: the concept of fear as a contagion is both profoundly fascinating and heartbreaking. These men were not cowards in any meaningful, moral sense. They were, in fact, human beings experiencing a perfectly normal, albeit overwhelming, reaction to mortal danger, a reaction that spread because they were all simultaneously engulfed by the same terror. Paradoxically, running statistically increased their likelihood of dying. It is one of those awful ironies of human instinct, leading one in precisely the wrong direction. Yet I find it impossible to judge anyone for making such a choice when their brain is screaming to flee and they witness everyone around them succumbing to the same desperate urge. Chapter 3: The Deadliest Mile. Once the battle lines irrevocably broke and men began their desperate flight, they immediately entered the most perilous phase of the entire engagement, a period during which the vast majority of medieval combat casualties actually occurred. This lethal toll was exacted not during the initial clash of armies, but during the relentless pursuit of the defeated. Let's revisit the Battle of Toten, as the sheer scale of the numbers here is profoundly important. A staggering 28,000 men met their end at Toten in 1461, and the overwhelming bulk of those deaths transpired during the rout. The area eventually dubbed the Bloody Meadow earned its infamous name precisely because of the horrific massacre that unfolded there, while the Cockbeck River, which the fleeing Lancastrians frantically attempted to ford, was reputedly so choked with gore that it literally ran red with blood. These are not mere literary metaphors, but rather chilling historical descriptions of the brutal reality when a medieval army broke and fled. The rout proved so exceptionally deadly because the act of turning one's back to the enemy instantaneously eliminated all defensive capability. A soldier positioned within a shield wall possessed protection, had his armor facing forward, held his weapon at the ready, and was capable of active resistance. In stark contrast, a man running away was utterly defenseless. His back is dangerously exposed. He had almost certainly dropped his heavy shield because it impeded his speed, and likely his weapon as well, prioritizing raw escape velocity over any possibility of defense. He simply could not protect himself at all. Medieval warfare possessed a brutally efficient mechanism specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability: cavalry. Light cavalry units were meticulously trained and equipped for pursuit, and horses, naturally, are considerably faster than humans, especially men encumbered by armor or carrying any amount of gear. The moment a line broke, cavalry units would launch into a relentless pursuit, cutting down fleeing soldiers from behind with devastating effect. Indeed, historical research emphatically confirms that the pursuing cavalry at Toten was responsible for the majority of casualties during the rout. Beyond the immediate physical danger, there was also the profound psychological torment of being relentlessly hunted. You are running, your legs burning with exhaustion, your lungs screaming for air, stumbling frantically over rough, unforgiving ground. And behind you, the terrifying sound of hooves grows ever closer. You know, with absolute certainty, that if those horsemen catch you, your life is forfeit. There is no possibility of fighting back, no chance for negotiation. You are a helpless target, slow and vulnerable, while your pursuers are swift and merciless. Research vividly describes the constant, terrifying crescendo of pursuing horsemen inexorably closing the distance. Pause for a moment to truly contemplate that image. You are in a full, desperate sprint, already utterly depleted, and the sound that signals your impending death is growing louder, closer, more insistent. And there is absolutely nothing you can do about it, save to keep running and pray that you are not the one they ultimately single out. There is a practical element here that is frequently overlooked. Medieval soldiers were invariably burdened with gear. Even the lightest foot soldier wore some form of padding, leather, or perhaps mail, all of which added considerable weight and severely restricted movement. Imagine attempting to run even a single mile while burdened with 20 pounds of equipment. It is utterly exhausting. Now, compound that with absolute panic, relentless cavalry at your heels, and treacherous terrain that could be muddy, rocky, or thickly forested. The sheer physical sensation must have been an unbearable nightmare. Here's another grim detail: the very terrain often transformed into a deadly trap. At Toten, fleeing soldiers desperately tried to cross the Cockbeck, a river with steep banks. When thousands of panicked men attempt to simultaneously cross such an obstacle, with cavalry bearing down on them from behind, scores are inevitably trampled, and many more drown. Rivers, in these chaotic circumstances, became deadly bottlenecks, and bottlenecks during a rout were invariably massacre points. Thus, the deadliest mile is not merely a vivid metaphor. It was literally the crucial distance between the point where the line shattered and the point where a soldier either managed to escape, was captured, or succumbed to sheer exhaustion. The chilling statistical reality is that most men did not survive beyond that mile. This, then, is the stark truth. This is where the medieval battlefield transitioned from merely violent to truly horrifying. Thousands of men running for their lives while cavalry systematically cuts them down from behind is not warfare in any romanticized sense. It is an outright slaughter. And the undeniable fact that this pursuit phase was the most lethal part of the entire battle powerfully underscores how the decision to run, which in the moment felt like pure self-preservation, so often culminated in an agonizing death sentence. The rout, unequivocally, was worse than the fight itself. Chapter 4: The Sound of the Hooves. Now, let's imagine you've miraculously survived the initial pursuit. You've successfully navigated past the deadliest mile, managing to put some crucial distance between yourself and the immediate chaos of the battlefield, perhaps by cleverly seeking out rougher terrain where horses struggled to follow, or by concealing yourself until the pursuing cavalry shifted their focus to other targets. But even then, you find yourself facing a fundamentally different, insidious kind of danger. You are utterly alone, or nearly so. The intricate structure of the army has completely dissolved, and while you might be accompanied by a handful of other fugitives, you are no longer part of an organized, protective group. You are deep in hostile territory, and now, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, every distant, unfamiliar noise, could signify your imminent demise. Historical research vividly depicts soldiers hiding in desolate marshes or dense woods, paralyzed by the mere sound of a twig breaking underfoot or the faint, distant echo of a horse. This is the profound, hypersensory experience of the fugitive. You cannot, of course, run indefinitely. Eventually, sheer exhaustion compels you to stop, to seek rest or concealment. And when you do, your senses become alarmingly hyperactivated, constantly attuned to the slightest hint of danger. Every single sound is meticulously analyzed, filtered through a lens of desperate fear. Is that a horse? Is that a patrol closing in? Are they actively searching for survivors? This is precisely what often transpired. Following a battle, the victorious side would routinely dispatch search parties, not only for the practical military objective of preventing scattered enemy soldiers from regrouping, but also for a far grimmer purpose: summary execution. Research clearly indicates that capture in such circumstances almost invariably meant immediate execution right there on the field. So you are crouched, perhaps in a freezing marsh or a thicket, desperately attempting to control your ragged breathing, forcing yourself not to move, just listening. The most terrifying sound you can possibly hear is the thud of hooves, because the distinct sound of a horse unequivocally means someone is approaching, and if they discover you, your death is assured. This harrowing phase of the deserter's experience is defined by a specific, suffocating kind of terror, utter helplessness. While you are running, you at least possess a semblance of agency. You are actively doing something, taking action. But when you are hiding, you are completely passive, your very survival hinging entirely upon the slender hope of not being found. You are too exhausted to fight, too depleted to run further, and any movement risks betraying your precarious position. All you can do is wait, listen, and desperately hope. The psychological toll of this state must have been immense, an almost unbearable burden. Your nervous system remains locked in a relentless fight-or-flight mode, yet you are utterly incapable of either, leaving you in a state of agonizing, frozen paralysis. Modern research on trauma unequivocally shows that this particular state, where your body is physically primed for action, yet you are unable to take any, is among the most profoundly psychologically damaging experiences a human being can endure. There is also the crushing element of isolation. Even amidst the most brutal moments of open battle, you are surrounded by other human beings, sharing a grim, collective experience. Now you are truly alone, perhaps with one or two other equally desperate fugitives, but you cannot even speak, for sound travels, and voices would instantly betray your location. This agonizing state could persist for hours, or even days. While historical research does not provide a specific time frame, which is entirely understandable given the wild variations in circumstances, try to imagine spending even a single full night hiding in a cold, damp marsh, exhausted, possibly injured, every nerve straining to interpret every sound, constantly wondering if the next sound will be the patrol that discovers and executes you on the spot. The ominous sound of the hooves, therefore, becomes symbolic of a deeper, broader truth. For the deserter, danger does not simply cease when the battle concludes. Instead, it transforms, becoming an ambient, pervasive threat. You are no longer confronting a single, identifiable enemy charge, but rather the ever-present possibility of discovery at any given moment. And that terrifying possibility stretches out into an indefinite, uncertain future. You have no way of knowing when, or if, you will ever truly be safe again. What continuously strikes me about this phase is its psychological insidiousness, a quality that open battle, ironically, lacks, because at least in direct combat, you understand the immediate source of danger. Hiding in the woods, straining to hear hooves, utterly uncertain if you are still being hunted or if the search parties have finally moved on, that is a very special, profound kind of hell. And the stark fact that capture invariably meant immediate execution adds an unbearable layer of finality to every passing moment. You are not waiting to be captured with the hope of ransom or imprisonment, you are simply waiting to be found and killed. Chapter 5: The Deserter's Mark. Let's assume, against truly insurmountable odds, that you somehow survived both the terrifying rout and the relentless pursuit. You managed to escape the immediate vicinity of the battlefield, and against all expectations, you are still alive. Now, however, you confront an entirely different set of consequences, meticulously formalized in law. Under King Henry V's stringent ordinances of war, first issued in 1419, the act of desertion was explicitly categorized as high treason. The statute unequivocally declared that any soldier who departs from his captain or from the host without leave shall be held as a traitor and suffer death. There was no ambiguity whatsoever. Desertion directly equated to treason, which in turn mandated execution. This was not a novel legal concept introduced in 1419. Statutes under King Richard II as early as 1385 had already formalized exceedingly strict penalties for desertion. The rigid class system inherent in medieval society becomes starkly apparent at this juncture. The esteemed code of chivalry dictated the expected conduct of nobles and knights in warfare, and if a knight was captured, an elaborate system of ransom and prisoner exchange was typically invoked, effectively assigning a tangible monetary value to their lives. For common soldiers, however, no such fortunate system existed. Historical research explicitly states that the harsh reality for commoners caught deserting often included potential branding, gruesome mutilation such as the loss of an ear, or a public hanging designed to serve as a stark warning to others. If you were apprehended as a deserter and not immediately executed on the battlefield, you faced one of several brutal punishments. Public execution, most commonly by hanging, was the prevalent method, and its public nature was specifically intended to act as a powerful deterrent. Authorities desired other soldiers to witness firsthand the grisly fate awaiting deserters. Mutilation, often involving the cutting off of an ear, was a common punishment serving a dual, cruel purpose, obvious physical torment, but also, and more significantly, a permanent, undeniable mark. You could not conceal the fact that you had been punished for desertion. Everyone who looked upon you would instantly know your ignominious past. This mutilation functioned as a living brand, ensuring that the crushing shame followed you relentlessly for the remainder of your life. Branding, sometimes literally performed with a hot iron, indelibly marked you as a deserter, operating on the same principle as mutilation. The intent was not merely to punish you in the moment, but to ensure you carried the unmistakable mark of your transgression forever. There was also the troubling issue of medieval military justice often being swift, arbitrary, and devoid of formal process. Research indicates that soldiers caught by their own side during a battle might be killed on the spot to prevent a mass rout from escalating. This stark reality meant that the legal apparatus we typically associate with justice, trials, formal sentences, appeals, did not always apply. If a commander determined that you needed to be made an immediate, gruesome example, you could be executed on the spot, with no trial, no appeal, and no legal process whatsoever. Here, an important caveat is provided by the research. In certain specific cases, commanders might judiciously choose to show mercy in order to retain valuable manpower, particularly if the desertion was clearly attributable to desperate circumstances like lack of pay or extreme starvation, rather than perceived cowardice. This implies that the actual application of these harsh penalties could vary significantly. A commander in dire need of soldiers might choose to overlook an instance of desertion if he believed the men could be effectively brought back into line, whereas a commander intent on sending an unequivocal message might publicly execute deserters without hesitation. The written law decreed one thing, but military expediency and the exigencies of reality sometimes demanded a degree of flexibility. Nevertheless, the default expectation remained one of severe, unforgiving punishment. And even if you managed to evade formal punishment, even if your commander inexplicably showed mercy, or you somehow slipped away entirely unnoticed, there remained yet another layer of consequences: the profound social repercussions. What truly strikes me about this aspect is the stark and truly ugly class divide it illuminates. Knights were afforded the dignity of ransom systems and prisoner exchanges, while common soldiers were subjected to mutilation or the gallows. It serves as a chilling reminder that medieval society profoundly valued certain lives over others, and this deeply ingrained inequality extended even to the very administration of military justice. The observation that commanders might exhibit mercy when in desperate need of manpower is indeed fascinating, demonstrating that even within such a brutal, rigid system, a raw pragmatism occasionally superseded the impulse for punitive retribution. However, I, for one, would never have gambled my life on the unpredictable pragmatism of a medieval commander. Chapter 6: Infamia? Even if you somehow managed to evade execution or gruesome mutilation, you still faced something that, in the long term, might have been even worse: social death. In medieval society, the concepts of honor and reputation were not merely abstract ideals. They possessed tangible legal and practical ramifications. If you were branded as a deserter, you immediately forfeited your standing within the community and became subject to what historical research terms infamia. Infamia, a concept rooted in ancient Roman law and revitalized during the Middle Ages, essentially signified the complete loss of one's legal standing and societal rights. The research is remarkably specific about the devastating implications of this status. A man deemed a coward not only lost his legal standing but became known as a nithing, or a man of utterly no repute, often compelled into exile as his own family might disown him entirely to safeguard their collective honor. To elaborate, the term nithing originates from Old Norse, literally meaning a man entirely devoid of honor. In medieval society, honor functioned as a vital form of currency. Your word and your public reputation fundamentally dictated your capacity to function, trade, and even exist within the community. Once declared a nithing, you were instantly transformed into a social pariah, an outcast. The legal consequences were dire and pervasive. Research clearly outlines that a deserter lost the fundamental right to testify in court, to inherit property, or to hold any position of trust. Consider the practical, crushing weight of this. You cannot testify in court, meaning that if someone wrongs you, you possess no legal recourse whatsoever. Your sworn testimony is deemed invalid, effectively stripping you of your voice within the justice system. You cannot inherit property, so even if your father passes away and leaves you land, you are legally barred from claiming it because your act of desertion has severed your connection to the family's inheritance structure. You are perpetually excluded from holding any office of trust or authority. You cannot become a guild member, hold public office, or even serve as a credible witness to vital contracts or business transactions. You have been systematically excised from the intricate legal and economic frameworks that govern society. You physically exist, yet you possess no legal standing, and you are no longer considered a full person in the eyes of the law. The social consequences, however, penetrated even deeper than the legal ones. Research highlights that your own family might disown you entirely to preserve their own honor, because in medieval society, shame was acutely contagious. If your son was a known deserter, a nithing, that ignominy directly reflected upon you and inflicted severe damage upon your family's reputation. Consequently, families would sometimes sever all ties, publicly and emphatically distancing themselves from the deserter to protect their own precarious standing within the community. Imagine that profound reality for a moment. You've survived the brutal battle, endured the terror of the rout, escaped the relentless pursuit, and somehow, you make it home. But your own flesh and blood, your family, refuses to take you in, because merely associating with you would irredeemably tarnish their reputation. You are, in essence, worse than dead, you are utterly erased. This is precisely why the research employs the chilling term social death, for that is precisely what it was. You were physically alive, yet your entire social existence had utterly ceased. You possessed no rights, no property, no family, no community, condemned to walk as a ghost through a society that had collectively decided you simply no longer existed. There was no genuine path to redemption or reintegration. Unlike a criminal who might serve a sentence and subsequently re-enter society, a deserter carried the indelible mark of infamia for life. There was no concept of rehabilitation, and the shame was an eternal burden. Research indicates that deserters were frequently forced into exile, and indeed, what other viable choice remained for them? If you cannot own property, cannot testify, cannot work in most respectable professions, and your own family has disowned you, what shred of life is left? Exile becomes the sole, desperate option, to leave and attempt to forge a new existence somewhere else, in a place where people are unaware of your ignominious history. But even there, you remain perpetually vulnerable, because if anyone ever discovers your past, if anyone learns what you did, the suffocating cycle of shame and exclusion would inevitably begin all over again. In medieval society, one's word was one's fundamental worth. And the deserter had, by his actions, proven that his word was utterly worthless. He had sworn an oath, whether formally to a lord, or to a military unit, or simply implicitly as a Christian man in a Christian society who agreed to fight, and he had broken it. A man who breaks his solemn word cannot be trusted, and that is the profound, underlying logic of infamia. You have demonstrated yourself to be fundamentally unreliable, and therefore, society has no further use for you. How profoundly different medieval society was from our own contemporary understanding. We tend to conceptualize shame as an emotion, an internal feeling. But for them, it was a legal status, a condition where you could quite literally forfeit your fundamental rights based solely on a moral judgment. The stark reality that your family might disown you to protect their own standing feels almost alien to modern sensibilities, yet it makes perfect sense within the ruthless logic of a society where collective reputation held far greater weight than individual survival. I simply cannot fathom the overwhelming loneliness of being utterly exiled from everyone and everything you've ever known, not because you committed a crime against another person, but because you chose, in a moment of primal terror, to save your own life. Chapter 7: The Broken Man. We have extensively discussed the severe legal and social ramifications of desertion. Now, it is imperative to address the spiritual consequences, for in medieval Europe, these were perceived as just as real, and arguably even more terrifying, than any earthly punishment. Medieval soldiers invariably swore solemn oaths, sometimes formal oaths of fealty to a lord, at other times oaths taken upon joining a military unit, or even simply the implicit oath of being a Christian man within a Christian society who had agreed to fight. Breaking such an oath was not merely a legal transgression, it was considered a grave, profound sin. Research categorically states that fleeing battle was not just a crime, but a sin of immense spiritual weight. This chapter, then, delves into the crushing burden of religious guilt and the pervasive fear of eternal damnation that plagued those who broke a sacred vow. To truly grasp its impact, we must understand its meaning within a medieval context. The medieval church unequivocally taught that oaths were sacred because they explicitly invoked God as a divine witness. When you swore an oath, you were, in essence, directly asking God to hold you accountable for your promise. To then break that oath constituted perjury in the eyes of God, a mortal sin, one of the most grievous transgressions that could condemn your soul to hell if you died unrepentant. Here is where the psychological burden becomes truly crushing. If you deserted from battle, you had undeniably broken an oath. However, to receive absolution for that sin, you would need to confess to a priest. That very priest, crucially, was an integral part of the same social structure that had already declared you infamia. Confession was not a private, anonymous act in the way we might conceive of it today. The priest knew exactly who you were and was intimately familiar with your ignominious history. Depending on the individual priest, he might refuse you absolution altogether, or impose a penance so impossibly severe that you could never realistically fulfill it. There was also the terrifying concept of excommunication. Research points out that breaking an oath of fealty was indeed considered perjury, a mortal sin that could lead to formal excommunication by the Church. Excommunication meant you were utterly cut off from all sacraments, you could not partake in communion, you could not receive the last rites, and most terrifyingly of all, if you died while excommunicated, your soul was believed to be unequivocally destined for hell. Consider the overwhelming psychological weight of this. You are already grappling with the profound trauma of battle, the sheer terror of the rout, and the searing shame of having fled. You are already socially dead, your family having disowned you, your legal rights stripped away, living in a desolate exile. On top of all this, you genuinely, deeply believe, in the unwavering way that medieval people believed, that your immortal soul is in grave jeopardy, and that you might spend eternity in unimaginable torment solely because of your actions. There was no secular framework, no alternative language, for comprehending this inner torment. You could not articulate, well, I was experiencing a panic attack and made a survival decision under extreme stress, because such terminology and understanding simply did not exist. The only available framework was a religious one, and that framework unequivocally informed you that you had committed a grave, unforgivable sin against God Himself. The research emphasizes that this crushing weight of religious guilt was by no means metaphorical. For a medieval individual who possessed an unshakable belief in heaven and hell, who was convinced that their actions in this earthly life directly determined their ultimate fate in the next, the knowledge that they had broken a sacred oath was spiritually devastating to the very core of their being. Here's an additional, agonizing layer. The medieval church also taught that suffering in this mortal life could serve as a form of penance for one's sins. If you found yourself living in desolate exile, mired in poverty, utterly shamed and rejected by everyone you had ever known, some profound part of you might begin to perceive that suffering as a deserved punishment, not merely from society, but directly from God. You might interpret every single hardship, every deprivation, as undeniable divine judgment for your perceived cowardice. This pervasive fear of eternal damnation also meant that deserters might spend the remainder of their shattered lives in desperate attempts to atone. Perhaps they would become obsessively pious, striving relentlessly to earn their way back into God's elusive grace. Perhaps they would embark on arduous pilgrimages, harboring the faint hope that such suffering would somehow balance the scales. Perhaps they would give away the very little they possessed to the church, desperate for any tangible sign that they might still be saved. Yet the gnawing doubt would never truly dissipate. How could you ever truly know if God had forgiven you? You couldn't. You were condemned to live with that unbearable uncertainty and that pervasive, existential fear. There was also a significant communal aspect to this religious life. In medieval villages, religion was not a private matter but a deeply communal one. Everyone attended Mass together. Everyone participated in shared religious festivals. If you were known as a deserter, as someone who had broken a sacred oath, people might actively shun your presence at religious gatherings, not solely due to social shame, but because they might genuinely believe you were spiritually contaminated, and that your very presence could potentially invite God's wrath upon the entire community. Even within the very realm of faith, which ideally should have been a source of profound comfort and solace, the deserter found only rejection and fear. The spiritual consequences of desertion thus created a cruel kind of triple imprisonment. You were legally trapped, stripped of all your rights. You were socially trapped, exiled from your community. And most profoundly, you were spiritually trapped, utterly cut off from the promise of salvation. There was no conceivable dimension of medieval life where you were not enduring severe, crushing consequences for your impulsive decision to run. This spiritual dimension is, for me, the most challenging to fully comprehend. I do not share the same profound framework of belief that medieval people possessed. But if you genuinely, deeply believe that breaking an oath places your immortal soul at eternal risk, that terror utterly transcends any physical danger. You may escape the battlefield, but you can never truly escape the terrifying fear of damnation. And the grim fact that atonement was always uncertain, that you could never truly know if you were forgiven, that is a special, exquisite kind of psychological torture. The deserter, tragically, could not even find peace in the embrace of religion. Chapter 8: Shadows of the Past. Now, let's finally discuss the fate of those men who, against all odds, managed to survive every horror we have explored so far. These were the individuals who made it through the brutal battle, endured the terror of the rout, survived the relentless pursuit, either evaded formal punishment, or served their penance and lived, and then found some tenuous way to exist in exile or on the remote margins of society. What, then, was life like for them? Historical research offers us truly remarkable insights here. Medieval people, unequivocally, experienced what we now clearly recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. While they naturally lack the precise terminology and the medical framework to define it, the symptoms meticulously described in their accounts are undeniably unmistakable. Research cites numerous historical accounts of the shakes and profound melancholy, emphatically noting that the trauma of fleeing from battle clung to these men until their very deaths. It also vividly describes soldiers becoming utterly paralyzed by fear, experiencing uncontrollable trembling, and suffering from a complete inability to properly hold a weapon. These are classic, well-documented symptoms of PTSD: hypervigilance, debilitating tremors, pervasive avoidance behaviors, and intrusive, haunting memories, all meticulously recorded in medieval chronicles. There are, for instance, documented accounts from the 14th century of knights who, after suffering a traumatic defeat, could no longer tolerate the mere sound of armor clinking or the unsettling sight of a blade. This is a quintessential trauma response, where specific stimuli associated with a horrific event, in this case, the very sounds and sights of combat, become unbearable, paralyzing triggers. For deserters specifically, this deep-seated trauma would have been intensely compounded by every other torment they were simultaneously enduring. It wasn't merely the memory of the brutal battle, but also the visceral memory of their desperate flight, of hearing thundering hooves relentlessly behind them, of hiding in abject terror and waiting to be discovered, of the chilling moment they realized their own side would kill them if they were caught. And then there was the profound, suffocating guilt. Modern PTSD research has convincingly demonstrated that moral injury, the deep psychological wound inflicted by having done something one profoundly believes was wrong or violated one's deepest values, can be even more damaging than fear-based trauma alone. Deserters would have been carrying both burdens. They had endured life-threatening danger, and they had simultaneously broken what their society considered a sacred, inviolable obligation. This dreadful combination would have been utterly devastating. The research refers to broken men who returned home. That phrase is incredibly telling, not merely wounded men or defeated men, but broken. Something fundamental, something essential, had been irrevocably damaged within their very core. And medieval society, in its own way, recognized this profound internal breakage, even if it entirely lacked the language or understanding to explain it medically. What would this have practically looked like, based on the symptoms so carefully documented in the research? The shakes refers to uncontrollable trembling that could manifest suddenly, triggered by a specific sound or memory, rendering a man unable to perform even simple tasks as his hands convulsed uncontrollably. Melancholy, what we would now term clinical depression, encompassed a deep, persistent sadness, a profound loss of interest in activities that once brought joy, and a pervasive withdrawal from all social interaction. For a deserter, already isolated and shamed, such depression would have been nearly inevitable. Nightmares, given the research's description of paralyzing fear and extreme responses to sensory stimuli, are also a reasonable assumption based on modern understanding of trauma. Deserters would have undoubtedly experienced terrifying nightmares about the battle, the pursuit, and the terror of being captured. Hypervigilance, stemming from the Listening for Hooves chapter, implies that this state of heightened, anxious alertness, where every sound potentially signals danger, does not simply subside once immediate physical safety is achieved. It becomes a chronic, ingrained condition. You are perpetually listening, constantly scanning for threats, utterly unable to relax because your nervous system remains permanently on high alert. Avoidance manifested as an inability to tolerate the sight of weapons or armor, a desperate compulsion to steer clear of anything that reminded them of combat. For a deserter attempting to merely survive in medieval society, this would have constituted a profound disability, as most forms of labor or community life had some direct connection to military service or the tools of war. How could one possibly function when the mere sight of a blade induces a full-blown panic response? The research clearly states that soldiers suffered from symptoms we now classify as post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by debilitating trembling, recurring nightmares, and a sudden, inexplicable inability to hold a weapon. That final detail is particularly poignant and significant. Imagine being a young man in medieval society, where your very ability to defend yourself, to earn a living, or to participate in community defense is inextricably linked to your capacity to wield weapons. And now you simply cannot, either because your hands shake too uncontrollably or because the sight of a sword freezes you in an instant. You are not just psychologically damaged, you are functionally disabled in a society that possessed absolutely no accommodations, no understanding, and no compassion for disability. There was no treatment, no therapy, no conceptual framework for understanding the profound psychological torment you were enduring. The only available explanations were tragically spiritual. Perhaps you were cursed, perhaps you were being divinely punished by God, or perhaps a malevolent demon had taken possession of your soul. None of these explanations offered any genuine help, and all of them would only exacerbate your suffering by layering on additional shame and fear. Research states unequivocally that the trauma of fleeing remained with these men until their deaths. This was not a condition from which one recovered, or a temporary phase that passed. This was a fundamental, permanent alteration of their psychological state that persisted, relentlessly, for the entire duration of their lives. Remember, these men were also simultaneously grappling with all the crushing social and spiritual consequences we have previously discussed. They were living in exile, or permanently marked as cowards, or disowned by their own families. They possessed no support structure, no community to lean on. They were living in abject poverty, likely scraping by on the extreme margins of society. On top of all this, they were contending with debilitating psychological symptoms that no one understood, and no one could possibly treat. The chapter title, Shadows of the Past, is perfectly apparent. The past was never truly past, it was always present, perpetually haunting them. Every unexpected sound could trigger a terrifying flashback. Every night brought forth agonizing nightmares. Every social interaction served as a painful reminder of their pervasive shame. The battle itself may have ended, but they were, in a very real sense, still living it, every single day. One final, crucial point worth noting: the research on medieval PTSD is derived from chronicles and accounts written primarily by educated observers, monks, nobles, clerks. These are the cases that were deemed worthy of documentation because they involved individuals of some social importance, or because their symptoms were so extraordinarily severe as to be noteworthy. How many countless common soldiers suffered in utter silence, with no one to document their profound symptoms? How many deserters lived and died with their deep-seated trauma, never once recorded in any chronicle, simply because they were not deemed significant enough to write about? The deserters who endured medieval PTSD were carrying an immense burden that no one acknowledged and no one could treat, in a society that had already judged them to be utterly worthless. They had, indeed, survived the battle, but they had lost everything else, including their own invaluable peace of mind. This is where the entirety of our discussion truly converges for me. PTSD is far from a new phenomenon, and the symptoms so vividly described in 14th century chronicles are precisely the same symptoms we observe in military veterans today. The fundamental difference lies in the fact that now, we possess a comprehensive framework for understanding it, and crucial treatments that can offer genuine help. Medieval deserters had nothing. They were broken, they remained broken, and they ultimately died broken. And in some profound way, that feels like the cruelest consequence of all. Not immediate death on the battlefield, not even social death, but the agonizing reality of living for decades with untreated, debilitating trauma in a society that relentlessly blamed you for your own suffering. Final thoughts. So, what truly happened to medieval soldiers who, in a moment of terror, ran away from battle? They were plunged into an inescapable cascade of devastating consequences that touched, and ultimately shattered, every dimension of their existence. Physically, they were mercilessly hunted down and frequently killed during the chaotic rout, a phase that invariably proved to be the deadliest of any medieval battle. Legally, they were unequivocally classified as traitors and faced the grim prospect of execution, mutilation, or permanent branding. Socially, they became infamia, stripped of their fundamental legal rights and often utterly disowned by their own families. Spiritually, they carried the crushing burden of a broken oath and the paralyzing fear of eternal damnation. And psychologically, they suffered from what we now recognize as severe PTSD, living with debilitating trauma symptoms that haunted them until their dying breath. The Battle of Toten in 1461, for example, claimed the lives of 28,000 men, the overwhelming majority during the rout, where the Cockbeck River reportedly ran red with blood, and the area where fleeing soldiers were brutally cut down earned its enduring, grim name, the Bloody Meadow. These are not abstract historical concepts. These are the horrific realities of what transpired when the battle line snapped and men made the desperate, split-second decision to run. King Henry V's ordinances of war, enacted in 1419, were explicit: desertion was treason, punishable by death. And while the actual enforcement of these laws undoubtedly varied, some commanders, driven by pragmatic needs for manpower, might occasionally show mercy. The default expectation was always one of severe, unforgiving punishment. Even if one somehow escaped the brutal physical punishments, it was virtually impossible to escape the profound social and spiritual consequences. Medieval society functioned critically on the bedrock of honor and reputation. A deserter had, by his very act, proven himself to be utterly without honor, and a man without honor had no place, no standing, in such a society. The pioneering research on medieval PTSD unequivocally demonstrates that these psychological wounds lingered and persisted long after the immediate physical danger had passed. Men who fled from battle lived with the shakes, with horrifying nightmares, and with an agonizing inability to tolerate any reminders of combat. They were broken men, and medieval society possessed no means, no compassion, and no understanding to help them heal. What strikes me most profoundly when examining all this meticulously gathered research is the truly impossible situation these men were placed in. Statistically, remaining steadfast in formation was demonstrably safer than fleeing. Yet, raw fear does not operate on cold statistics. The decision to flee was almost invariably made in a moment of unadulterated, blinding panic, a sudden, involuntary snap decision when the line broke, and primal survival instinct completely overrode years of training and discipline. That one agonizing moment, that desperate choice, ultimately defined the entire remainder of their lives. Were they considered cowards by medieval standards? Unequivocally, yes. However, by a modern understanding of human psychology operating under extreme stress, they were simply individuals exhibiting a perfectly normal, albeit overwhelming, response to mortal terror, making a choice that most of us have never had the agonizing misfortune to confront, and hopefully never will. The choice was stark: stay and possibly die, or run and definitely face a cascade of consequences that might prove far worse than death itself. The research makes it abundantly clear that medieval warfare was a world away from the often romanticized images we sometimes harbor. It was not a realm of chivalrous knights in shining armor engaging in honorable duels, but rather, for the common soldier, it was an arena of abject terror, bewildering chaos, and the chilling, very real possibility that one's own fundamental instinct for survival would tragically lead to a decision that would utterly destroy their entire life. 28,000 men perished at Toten. We remember the battle, but how many countless men survived Toten and other battles like it, only to die socially, spiritually, and psychologically, simply because they had made the desperate choice to run? How many lived out their remaining years in desolate exile, permanently branded as cowards, utterly disowned by their own families, suffering from debilitating, untreated trauma, waiting for a final death that might bring either eternal damnation or, perhaps, merciful relief? The medieval soldier who fled from battle did not, in any meaningful sense, truly escape. He merely traded one brutal form of death for another. And in a great many cases, the slower, agonizing death, the social and spiritual obliteration that inevitably followed, was far, far crueler than the swift end he might have found on the blood-soaked battlefield.